So today we're talking about surveys, and I want us to think about surveys that we may have taken recently. So I gave you guys a survey to take at the beginning of class using Google Docs, and it was sort of closed-ended responses where you got to choose the answers. I recently took the census survey. I don't know if you've done that yet. I also think it's important to recognize that surveys are not just used for research purposes, but also corporations use surveys. When you call customer service centers for issues that you have with your banking or a product that you bought or whatnot, they often ask you if you can take a survey at the end. And then when you go to stores, sometimes receipts will have a survey and a discount code for incentives. And so surveys are I feel one of the most common forms of not only research, but just where we see research sort of blending in our everyday lives. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, sort of the strengths and weaknesses of surveys and why they're so popular. So in our prior lectures, we've talked about how to construct theory into ideas and questions and interests, and sort of how we conceptualize these broader ideas into things that are more tangible that we can communicate and analyze. And then how to ensure that the way that our data is constructed, the space that we're taking them from, the sampling, is representational so we can actually make statistical conclusions and measure our error. And so we talked about experiments and how they're really good at doing that. And now we're going to talk about survey research, which, like I said, is very popular in its use and also can be pretty quantitative and has sort of a unique role in that sometimes it can help us actually count everyone in a specific population. And of course, we're always going to be talking about analysis and application as well. So, like I said, surveys are very, very popular. It's probably the most frequently used not only in social science research, but like I said, with corporations and whatnot. And some examples that you may have heard of, one definitely is the census, which we'll use as an example later and talk more specifically about how the census tries to count everyone in the US and the methods that it uses. But it offers us demographic information on a national level, so it gives us a picture of everyone within the US who resides in it. Then there's the General Social Survey, which we'll also talk about as an example, and it's sort of one of the longest running attitudinal surveys. So it asks people questions about their beliefs and their opinions. And then there's the Annual Survey of Jails, which is interesting because often we think of surveys as the unit of analysis are individuals, people specifically. They're filling out a questionnaire, or a research assistant field worker is helping them fill out a questionnaire or taking their answers down. But sometimes, especially with the Bureau of Justice, there are specific surveys that are sent to the top police department head of specific jurisdictions and counties, and these administrators, these higher officials, are the ones that fill out the survey. And so it's sort of required as their job to do so. And we see this a lot too, in not just criminal justice, but nonprofits, state nonprofit associations will conduct surveys of all of the nonprofits within a state, or I'm trying to think of another one, but you'll have like sort of associations, like professional associations that also do their own internal surveys, so they know how to best serve the organizations that they're affiliated with. So just to review, we've seen surveys before, and when we were talking about the dark figure of crime and measuring crime in general, and we know that surveys were a means to help us understand that the crime data we get from police reports is often very skewed and biased because it's dependent on where police are deployed, and where they see crimes occurring, and also when they get called. And we know that police, people calling the police, varies across demographics and whatnot. So surveys were a way for us to understand that crime occurs in different spaces based off of self-report data. So people anonymously reporting whether or not they committed certain crimes, and telling researchers sort of like how frequently they do it, the extent by which they do it. And that allowed us to really see that there was a gap in understanding crime and crime figures. And then there's also the idea of counting crime through victimization surveys. So not only where people self-report whether or not they've been committed crimes, but also people sort of talk about them being victims of crime, and that helps us fill the dark figure and reporting gap that occurs through police collected data. And surveys can be used for descriptive, explanatory, exploratory, and applied research, like I said. So the applied research aspect of it would be like the professional associations, where there's sort of an organization that's trying to use that survey data to sort of frame their agenda, or to understand like how they can better serve the organization they represent. And then exploratory would be a survey that is more trying to address a topic that hasn't really been touched upon, but they're sort of exploring the aspects of it. So some pilot surveys might fall into this. Explanatory surveys are sort of like, you can get them from like mixed use surveys. So if there's like the general social survey has a bunch of questions about behaviors and attitudes, so you could sort of map people's behaviors and attitudes, and how they cause, or like what types of behaviors might be caused by certain attitudes. And then there's more descriptive. So Annual Survey of Jails is also descriptive. It describes jails and the demographics of people they have in jails, and the amount of population that they have in the jail. So it's descriptive. And those are sort of the four basic types of research that surveys can be used for. And so that's pretty broad, like compared to experimental methods, which are much more based off of explanatory means. Surveys can be used in a wide range of research purposes, which is part of what makes them so popular. And so there are definitely, in regards to counting crime, surveys can have their own issues, right? So when we're talking about victimization surveys, there's definitely an issue with recall error. Sometimes, especially when you're dealing with trauma, people don't necessarily remember what happened, or they're reluctant to discuss the victimization with interviewers like face to face, because that might be a little intimidating. But there may also be a sense of ways that you can get around that. So you could prompt, sort of come back to that specific person doing that survey and ask them to do a similar survey a second time. So that way that you're sort of prompting them to think about ways in which they were victimized and to do that once again. So the self-report, I just want to note there are sort of two emphases in self-report surveying of crime. So there's the frequency of offending, how many crimes and various types are committed by active offenders over a period of time, so people who are actively doing these offenses, and then there's the prevalence of offending. So how many people commit crimes in contrast to a broader population. So this is what you'll see in a lot of the youth delinquency surveys, is that they're trying to understand, okay, how prevalent is youth delinquency in regards to like a larger youth population. And when we can also apply terms that we've learned about prior. So there's validity and there is reliability, right? And so recall error and reporting of false events can be a problem that is definitely connected to reliability, because you're not getting reliable respondents, and therefore the data that you have isn't reliable. It's has some level of false data to it. And self-report surveys are also an issue because sometimes people don't want to report the crimes that they committed as well. So that also decreases your reliability as well. Okay. Wait, I just want to go. Okay. So there are, besides outside of criminal justice, there are a whole slew of reasons that people administer surveys, right? So sometimes, like I mentioned with the general social survey, people want to understand perceptions and attitudes. And especially in regards to criminal justice, some things we'll think about is crime salience. So maybe not necessarily, crime salience is this term that describes how important crime is, or how much people think about and fear crime, and how much they care about crime and worry about it. So how present of an issue it is in their everyday lives. And so that's something that a lot of criminal justice researchers will think about as a conception and try to measure. And there's actually data that shows that people who are in neighborhoods that have less crime have a really strong crime salience, and that's often why there's a lot of support for more punitive crime policies as well. And besides that, perceptions and attitudes about like politicians and a lot of the polling data we get, and like that tries to determine which elected official will win an election, like comes with surveys. And general perceptions and attitudes about certain social policy is very highly surveyed, especially because politicians want to know what policies they should pass. And so perceptions and attitudes are definitely a huge topic for survey research. And then targeted victim surveys, so like more localized in a specific area, might be used to evaluate policies that police are trying to implement, or nonprofit restorative justice programs and whatnot. And then there are other means to sort of measure community attitudes and citizen responses. So how communities feel about police or their specific police department can also be included in that. And then there's definitely counting impact. So for populations that we know exist, but we sort of don't know how large of a population they are, surveys can help sort of bring to light how large this specific population is. So, for example, people with wrongful convictions, there's been recent data on researchers trying to survey people who are incarcerated to get them to disclose whether or not they were wrongfully convicted. And obviously there are issues with that because you don't necessarily know if they're telling the truth or whatnot. So there's some like statistical methods to try to estimate the error within that. And then there's also surveys. There's a recent survey that actually Professor Wakefield, who's in our department, did with a nonprofit that tried to estimate how many family members have someone who's incarcerated in their lives to get at the sort of larger impacts of incarceration on families and children. And then we also use surveys for theoretical constructs too. So social disorganization has this idea of collective efficacy, and that is an idea where it's the willingness of neighbors, people in communities to intervene in a specific instance. And so a lot of the ways that researchers measure that is through survey methods and asking people, how frequently do you engage with your community? How frequently do you go to community meetings? Would you be willing to intervene if you saw a crime committed by a youth in your neighborhood and whatnot? So that is measured through survey methods. So it's sort of like a bunch of survey questions that are constructed into like a scale to develop that idea of collective efficacy. And then definitely with broken windows theory, which is the idea that the visual aspects of a neighborhood, if you see a broken window, then you're more likely to commit crime because the neighborhood is signaling to people passing by that like crime is okay here, there's a level of disorder here that sort of domino effects into larger crimes. And so in that instance, then it's really important to understand crime perception and perceptions of disorder, and that can be done via survey. And then if we think about anomie and strain theory, which says that people who see other people who have a lot of wealth, because wealth and consumerism are huge parts of US culture, are going to try to attain that through illicit means if they don't have legal means to do so. So you can get at that sort of wealth perception and how people see themselves, if they see themselves as wealthy or not, and if they are attracted to sort of those consumer habits that are out of their means as well. And so you can get at that through survey methods as well. So, as you can see, there's like a whole bunch of means in which you could use survey methods to analyze questions and data and get at a larger demographic descriptive picture of certain populations, and so it has wide-ranging uses. An application, like if you're in your own nonprofit and you're trying to analyze the effectiveness of your nonprofit, you might do a survey on your clients that you serve. And so they're widely used, and the key importance of developing them is actually constructing the questionnaire and making sure that it's clear to the respondents what you're actually asking. So here are some guidelines for asking good questions. And like I said, this is the single most important aspect of survey research when you're preparing to do a survey, is constructing the questions so that way they're not confusing. And so there are types of questions. You can ask open-ended questions where respondents type in their own answer, write in their own answer, say their own answer, and they don't need to select from a list of answers. And so this is great because, especially for exploratory work, like if you don't already have a background in what the answers to the questions might be, but it can also be hard to, especially if you are doing this, to analyze all the answers that you get, because they're going to be broad in range, but you sort of have to code for the themes of it and do some more qualitative analysis, which we'll get into next week. All of these aspects of creating questions is how you develop the questionnaire, which is sort of either the form or the online survey that has all the questions that are supposed to be in your study. And also an issue with open-ended question is that the researchers need to interpret what the answer is as well and like code it, like I was talking about. So there could be some, depending on the researcher, there could be differences in how they code or analyze or interpret the answers. So often if you have more open-ended questions, it's ideal to have multiple researchers try and code the same thing so there is some level of consistency and inter-rater reliability. And sometimes people will answer the questions in ways that are not what the researcher intended. So they may, depending on how you word your question, maybe they only answer one part of it, or see one word that they resonate with and just talk about that one word, right? So you can't really control the responses or the quality of responses that you get. So closed-ended questions are when there's a list of answers that the researcher, the question provides, and the respondent has to choose one of them. And so this is very nice because it can be easily developed into quantitative analysis, because you can have a code book and sort of use the answers directly and count how many people said A, B, or C. But because it is exclusive, it needs to be exhaustive and mutually exclusive. So your choices your respondent can only choose one choice, and they sort of need to be separate from each other. You can do closed-ended responses where people can check off multiple things. And it gets a bit complicated in that way. And you really need to think when you're developing the answers yourself, like what people imagine when they see that answer, and that all of the possible responses that might be expected are there. And some people get around that by saying like none of the above. So that can be a response if the person taking the questionnaire doesn't identify with any of the answers as their choice. And then there's questions and statements. So sometimes a question will be framed as like, in the past month, have you done this behavior? No, not at all on one side, and then yes, very frequently. And so there's a spectrum in between, and that's called a Likert scale. So there's varying degrees on a range. And this is a nice way at getting at opinions or trying to quantify behavior in a way that gets at the magnitude of things. Because there's also like the very much disagree or very much agree. So you can get sort of the quantify your answer in a way that gets at magnitude. But the issue with this is you don't know if very much agree and agree are the same as very much disagree and disagree. You don't know that the space between those are exact. It could take less for someone to say very much disagree than it could take for someone to say very much agree. So it gets a little tricky in that it's not a truly quantifiable way, but it's not like super statistically valid, but it does give you some sense of quantifiability within error. Okay. And it's really important to make items clear. So you have to avoid ambiguous wording or like even the way you word things. Sometimes people interpret things differently. So if you're asking, like, if you're putting qualifiers in your question, like, is it okay to put suspects in jail versus is it okay to put people who have not yet been convicted in jail? Those are the same question. They mean the same type of person, but you get very different images when you hear them. It sounds much more harsh to put someone who's not convicted in jail than it is to put a suspect in jail, right? But they're the same person legally. So you need to really be careful about how you word your questions because they could elicit responses that are very different. So sometimes researchers will have different types of questionnaires that sort of play with wording and try to address that wording in that way. And then you also want to avoid ambiguous questions and use very like neutral, simple language that's clear what the question being asked is. You can't say like, would you like to divert funds from policing into community organizations in the same question? That's a lot. It's better to sort of break down questions that have, if you find that you're writing and in your question, I would encourage you to break it down more because then you're sort of, the respondent might agree with one part of your question and not another part of it. Short items are best, like I said, if you find that you're saying and or putting commas or semicolons, your question is long, then people are going to get distracted by aspects of the question. And oftentimes, too, if you're like developing your own questionnaire, there are likely people who've done a similar questionnaire. So it's nice because you can sort of search survey methods for the topic you're interested in and see if there's a sample questionnaire that you can do. I did that for my dissertation in undergraduate and found someone who had looked at what I was looking at already, and I developed questions off of a survey that had been previously used. Short items are best. So that means the answer choices also need to be short. It's going to be harder for people. I mean, when people are taking questionnaires, there's sort of a fatigue that develops as they're answering the questions. So sometimes people find answering questions fun, but the more effort and time they have to put into really thinking about their answer, the less likely they're going to accurately answer it or answer the entire questionnaire. They may just not want to answer the full of it. And avoid negative items. So framing things in the affirmative can make things less confusing. So I'm sure you've taken a test where the question is framed in like, which of the following is not likely to be the answer? Like, those are often harder questions, don't you think? So it makes sense to try to make sure that the questions themselves are not in the negation. Biased items and terms. Yeah, don't ask questions to encourage a certain answer. I think I talked about this a little bit when it was like suspect versus person not convicted. And you really need to think about if your questions are encouraging people to answer in a specific way. And you can think about that too when you're reading other people's research. Say you find a research study that you don't really agree with what they're saying, you can look through their survey methods, which are often in the appendix, and see like how they worded their questions. And then there's also social desirability that gets developed, and biased items and terms are more likely when there's an interviewer doing the interview and it's not anonymous or not self-administered, because people are more likely to answer the question in a way that is seems socially desirable. For example, like if you were trying to analyze people's like racial bias and you had interviewers who were people of color, then people are maybe more likely to answer desirably and like a little bit less biased towards people of color. And then there's also ways to incorporate technology to make things a little bit easier to get through. And so you can use disclaimers, like I said, or make sure that the respondent knows that the questionnaire is anonymous, that you won't be taking any of their like personal identifiable information. Oh no, I don't know why this is not showing up. The last one should be matrix questions here. I don't know what happened to my slide, but I'll edit that before I post it. So after you settle on all of the questions that you develop in your content, you have to consider the format of what you're doing. So if you're doing a paper form, it should look very clear what the directions are, how they should check things, or how they should mark the questionnaire, and it should look very uncluttered and like feel like a guideline for people to move through. It's better to have more questions than like to try to squeeze multiple questions in one question, like we talked about with the double-barreled questions. And then another way to sort of format a questionnaire and its structure that you can do via paper, but is a little bit easier to do via the internet, is to have contingency questions. So if I am wanting to get at say I'm doing a victimization survey and I'm asking if you've ever been physically assaulted, and all of these different, like physically assaulted, verbally, all of these different things. If there are follow-up questions for those who have been verbally assaulted, then this is where you would have contingency questions. Because if someone said they were not verbally assaulted and you're therefore asking them a bunch of questions about being verbally assaulted, they might get frustrated and not want to take the rest of the quiz or the questionnaire. So this is a way to ensure that questions that are only relevant to a certain number of respondents, they are the only ones that answer it. So there's ways you could do that on a paper form, in which you're like, skip questions 8 through 9 if you answered no. And you can do that very easily via web-based surveys, because you can sort of program the questionnaire to sort of go in different directions based off the answer, like a little hierarchy. And that's on the back end. They're not going to see that in the front end. And then this should say matrix questions. I'll fix that. And so this is when you ask several questions that have the same set of answer categories. So Likert scales, like we talked about, like very much disagree, very much agree. And this has some advantages. It uses space efficiently, so you can have like a scale at the top, and the person can just go through the questions and feel like they get a rhythm of what the answers could be. And that makes respondents find it easier to fill through. And it increases the comparability of the responses, so you can compare questions to each other. But it may promote structuring an item so that the responses fit into the matrix. So you might find yourself pressured because of the structure of the format to ask your questions in a way that don't necessarily fit with your constructs, because it's just easier. And it can develop a response set for the respondents. So they may just say like, oh, I get what they're getting at. It's just very much agree. And that's like the one answer I'm going to do for all of them. And I'm not going to read the questions as thoroughly because I'm bored or because I'm fatigued and tired of doing this questionnaire. And ordering questions is really important too. It can affect the answers given. So it might be better to ask open-ended questions first, so people feel more interested in giving their specific opinions. You can sort of get around this in some online formats. They'll like scramble the question order is one way to go about it. You can have more than one version, so that way you make sure that like the questions all at the end. Some of them get answered because in some questionnaires they're at the beginning. And you would want to begin with the most interesting questions in a paper format, and then end with duller demographic data. Because oftentimes, like people understand surveys as like a quiz, and it's sort of fun. So if they feel like, oh, they're asking very interesting questions, they might be more likely to fill the end of it. And when they have that fatigue and tiredness of answering questions, they're just filling out their demographic data at the end, which makes it easier for them to do, right? Because we know that information about ourselves very well. But this is sort of the opposite with in-person interview surveys. You want to sort of establish a rapport and build up to the questions when you're doing in-person surveys. So there have been a ton of different methods of administering surveys. Like the oldest are the home delivered surveys, where researchers would go physically to someone's house and ask them to participate in this research project and give them a questionnaire and then say, oh, I'll come back in a couple of days to pick it up. Then there are mailed surveys, where people get a survey in the mail with a postage stamp to send the survey back to the researchers. Then there's surveys done via telephone. So people will be called on their cell phone or home address and asked to take a survey then and there. Or sometimes researchers will ask to schedule an appointment for a survey. There are online surveys that are done via the internet, and then there are in-person surveys done as well. So like people might be recruited to do a survey and they have to go to a specific location or meet the researcher at a specific time. There's supplementary survey material content that you can develop that doesn't include the questionnaire that could be helpful. So there are cover letters, and this can be in online format or in paper format. And so this sort of provides a background, a prompt of like what exactly the survey is, what's the purpose, why that respondent was selected, why it's important to complete the questionnaire in full, and to like include the institutional affiliation or the sponsorship, because people do want to know like who's funding it. And when you do this online, it's a little bit more tricky because online stuff is more visual, so you want to make sure that if you have images or pictures that you're putting to sort of represent your survey, to know that those might prompt your respondents to answer in a certain way. So if you're doing a survey about health and you have a bunch of images of like healthy people running and the respondent takes it, they might be less likely to report that they have done a lot of exercise because they see this person running and they think, I haven't done that in quite some time. So be careful when you're doing online surveys and developing cover letters, and sort of keep it simple and don't like prompt people, unless that's part of what your survey is doing, is trying to understand how prompts affect them. You want to make sure your cover letter too doesn't have any affiliation that might have some controversial image or have a specific response from the respondent that might make them not want to take the survey. So yeah, just be wary of that. Then there's also warning mailings and like reminder emails to increase responses. And so this will help increase response rates. In practice, when we're talking about mail surveys, it's usually that 3 mailings are most effective. So an original questionnaire that's sent with a cover letter, and then 2 follow-up email warnings or messages. And then response rates are, so you sent the survey to a bunch of people, how many actually filled it out? And the way you can get at this is there can be incentives. So I recently got a questionnaire in the mail and there was a dollar bill in it, and the questionnaire said that I would get more money if I submitted it. So that's a way to increase response rates. And the way you can do that too is you can put a unique identifier on the questionnaire, so you know who submitted what and who you need to follow up with. So you can track in real time your response rates. When you're doing online surveys, there could also be financial incentives to increase response rates. And you should try to have a good, an adequate response rates, but you also have to balance that response bias and response rate are sort of inversely associated. So the higher response rate, that's great, but it's likely that you're going to have higher response bias, which means that people are answering the survey but not necessarily fully accurately. And these are really rough guidelines. There's no like statistical association with these numbers. It's just sort of convention of what people think are good response rates. And this is going to depend too on like the population you're targeting. Like this, you're trying to analyze your program's effectiveness and your client response rate is super low, you can't really say with accuracy how effective your program is being. So the response rate, those are the conventional standards, but you also need to take into account the type of population you're trying to reach. And response rates tend to be higher for surveys that target a very narrowly defined group. And general population surveys tend to have lower response rates. So if we're trying to count everyone, then the response rates will be lower just because the population is sort of larger. Web-based surveys are becoming very popular. They're sort of easy to develop. You can use a bunch of tools like SurveyMonkey, Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is sort of this website where researchers can post questionnaires, and Amazon and the researchers sort of develop a financial rate that the questionnaire respondents get a monetary value. And they're sort of like people who are always ready to fill out the survey. So if you're looking for money and you want to get some fast cash, you can sign up for Mechanical Turk and just fill out a bunch of questionnaires. And there's Google Forms like I used for my survey of you guys that helps people manage the data they get. In Google Forms, you can often get an Excel document that you can then use to analyze in statistical software. You can more easily test question ordering effects, so you can scramble the questions. And it's a good use for piloting larger scale surveys. So say you're trying to do a larger population survey, but you don't have the resources, so you're doing a pilot study, and you can use that data to get funding and take and expand on your survey later. And it's very important to recognize that online surveys are highly visual in nature because you can see everything on the screen, right? It's not like one single piece of paper that can be organized into like different structure and have linear dividers. Like you usually get one question per screen and then it takes you to the next screen. And so that causes a large visual space. So you want to make sure that the wording is large enough. The things are clear. If you're putting visuals in your online questionnaire, like I said, you want to make sure that you recognize it might be prompting people to respond in certain ways. And you can very easily do contingency questions. So if this person responds, you can do on the back end. If this person responds to this question, then they get this question after it, and you don't need to have the respondent do the work of, okay, this answer didn't apply to you, skip to question 10. They don't need to do that. You do that on the back end. There's issues with, there's also issues with doing online surveys, so representativeness, finding and selecting samples of internet users can be difficult. Oftentimes we depend on our own social network in the internet space. And it could be seen as spam, so there might be less incentives to do them online because there are so many online surveys. And people could be suspicious of it being malware or a virus, so they might not do it. And only about 78% of the population has access to the internet. So you're inherently getting a biased sample because we know that the people who do have access to the internet tend to be younger, better educated, white, and have higher income. So inherently you have some bias in the responses that you are able to get in the entire sample frame. And there's a little bit less accuracy in regards to, because it's just a person that is anonymous in a large way, people can use false identities or rush through a survey. And some tips, like we mentioned, it's highly visual in nature. There's also a contrast effect. So if your questions and answers are sort of contrasted, then they might seem more spread apart, and you need to think about that. And then people generally feel like the top is good visually, so they'll more likely go with the top answer than the bottom answer. So you want to be careful about the response answers that people can choose. Okay, so an example of this is the census. It was the first time that it was mostly administered online this year. It's still going. They extended the census deadline because of the pandemic, but we're in the 2020 census. They do it every 10 years, and it's a survey to try to get an accurate picture of everyone in the US, all of the residents in the US. And because it's a large sample survey, there's likely to be a higher or a lower response rate because you're trying to get like an entire picture of a large population. You're not getting a smaller sample that's supposed to be representative of a larger sample. You're trying to get the larger sample, which is US residents. And so it collects social, economic, and geographic data. It's based off of households, so it is harder to count populations that are more transitory or don't live in the same space or don't necessarily own or rent a home themselves, but maybe live with family members or have more difficult housing issues. So it's an attempt to count all US residents every 10 years. It's probably one of the most extensive actual count of residents. And it's part of a constitutional provision, so it's constitutionally required for us to count all US residents every 10 years. And it helps determine congressional districts and allocate resources, so it sort of helps federal spending allocation. It's dependent on the population data that the census develops. And a lot of demographic, economic, and social data that scientific researchers depend on are based off of the census. Let's see. Okay. So there's also in-person interview surveys. So this is when there's a face-to-face interviewer that comes to your door and schedules an appointment with you, or that you schedule an appointment with someone to do the survey. And so there's a field researcher who goes into the field and talks to people and is the person administering. It's not self-done, so it's not like the respondent is doing it on a piece of paper themselves or through a computer themselves. It's instead the field researcher is the one that is taking down the responses of the respondent participant. So the interviewers ask the questions orally and record the respondents' answers. And this usually causes higher response rates than mail surveys do. And this can help respondents with confusing items when you're doing in-person interview. So the respondent can ask you questions about the question and say, I'm confused by this. What does the question mean? And you can sort of provide support for the respondent. And the interviewer can also probe for additional responses. And this gets into more like, depending on how you frame this, it can be more qualitative in nature and be like a structured qualitative interview, which is a little bit less bounded by like a questionnaire and is more broadly structured. So we may get back to something that sounds a little similar to this when we talk about qualitative methods. And it's really important for the interviewer, the field researcher, to not try to lead people into specific answers and to appear non-judgmental when the respondent is answering questions, because there could be some bias that occurs because of that. And it's often hard to do this with things that are a little bit more sensitive. So if you have a bunch of male field researchers interviewing women about violence that they've been victims of, they may be less likely to respond. So you need to think about sort of the positionality of the interviewers and how to make people comfortable in answering questions and what types of questionnaires are more appropriate for in-person surveys. And this sort of neutrality has to come with probing responses too. So like if you're asking follow-up questions of the respondent, it should be in a very neutral way where they don't feel like they're being reprimanded for their answer. And like all of the field researchers need to be trained in the same way, because they could get very different answers based off of like how they're approaching the respondents. So they should practice and also have like some trial runs with real interviewers. And it's good when you're doing these in-person interviews to sort of dress in a way that's similar to the respondents that you're engaging with and the interviewees, because if you're very formal in your dress and someone is more casual, then there's sort of this power differential that occurs where the respondent might not be as willing to disclose things if they're trying to be socially viewed as better or something like that. So you need to do a lot of mirroring and make sure that people feel comfortable in this space. And you could also do this with computer-assisted technology. So you can do computer-assisted personal interviewers where the interviewer reads a question from a screen and then types in the answer. If you think about this, when you go to the doctor, sometimes this is how they do. This is like what your doctor does, right? They'll like log into their portal and then they'll ask you a bunch of questions about your health and whatnot and type it in and type your symptoms into their database. And so that's computer-assisted personal interviewing. And that computer can be incorporated in these in-person interviews as well. And then there's computer-assisted self-interviewing. So you might, oftentimes this happens like in your intake for something. Like, for example, if you go to the mental health resource on campus, they'll ask you to fill out sort of an assessment before you get matched with a therapist. And so that assessment is self-administered. You're taking it yourself. You're answering questions about yourself. And this is when this can be adapted to in-person interviews where maybe the interviewer has an iPad or something like that, and they give it to the respondent, and the respondent takes the interview there and can ask the field researcher questions about specific questions if they don't understand. But then the benefit of it is also that you get responses that you can easily code and get transmitted easily. And there's like some more level of anonymity when it's a computer-assisted self-interviewing, because the researcher, the field worker, isn't looking at all of the responses, right? And it could be quicker when there's this technology that's incorporated. And like we said, it's a higher enhancement of confidentiality. You can do it in different languages in a way that's sort of cost effective if you can't train all of your field researchers to know specific languages. And your answer responses and questions can be more visually engaging if you're trying to get at like visual prompts and how they affect people's opinions or thoughts. You can more easily like provide vignettes of specific situations and what people think about them. So there's more creative license when you're doing computer-assisted interviews versus when you're auditorially having to explain what the question is, right? And there's more neutrality too, because your tone is not influencing how the person is responding. It's instead they're engaging with something that is a little bit more neutral. The sort of disadvantages is that there's more upfront investment. You have to invest in the computers. There's huge technology problems that can happen. So if like you need Wi-Fi and it's just not working, that can get very frustrating. So you sort of need to have backup plans for if the technology fails you. And these things are sort of difficult to audit and to print and archive. So an example of this is the General Social Survey, and it's a general purpose survey. So it has not a specific purpose, but it's just a large opinion portal on different people's attitudes and behaviors, and it's been done since 1972. It's like one of the longest running attitudinal surveys, and it is representative of the US population as a whole. And the way that it does that is it uses probability sampling and multi-stage clustering. And the questions that they ask get asked on a recurring basis. So they don't get asked like every single year, but they get asked like every 3 years. So you can do some trend analysis of the attitudinal behaviors and opinions across time. Many of their questions are on a Likert scale, like either a 3-point Likert scale or 5-point Likert scale. And it's done out of the University of Chicago, NORC. And it's sort of really cool. I use this database for my undergraduate thesis. There's a HelpCrim, which is like how effective do you think the US response is to preventing crime, and people answer like very satisfied, not satisfied at all, and how satisfied they are with the US's response to crime. And so you can analyze like what types of people are more likely to respond to that, and like also other demographic behavior and how that influences people's responses. And so they actually use the computer-assisted personal interview, and they've done that since 2002. So there's a computer there when the field workers, field researchers interview the respondents. They're typing answers into a computer. And a lot of their answers are closed-ended answers. So that makes that easier as well. And so the person being interviewed can ask questions about the framing of the questions, and it allows for that data to be transmitted in real time and sort of cuts cost of data entry and whatnot. There's also telephone surveys, and so 95% of all households have telephones, but we see that landline phones are sort of a dying breed, so that should be an indication that there's sort of good things and bad things about that. We're not dependent on housing for people to have access to cell phones. People can have more transitory housing and still have a cell phone, right? And landline phones are like now in the minority of people have landline phones, and a lot of people only have cell phones now. So there's this method of random digit dialing, which sort of helps in selecting a sample that is based off of probability, and you can generalize to the larger population. But sometimes you'll get businesses, payphones, fax lines that aren't necessarily people, right? And that messes with the sample. But telephone surveys can be fast and relatively low cost. You can save money and time, and you get sort of greater control over data collection. And you can get things conducted in different languages via the phone. And random digit dialing uses computer algorithms to generate lists of random telephone numbers, usually the last 4 digits. So the nice thing about telephone numbers is if I wanted to do something on the East Coast, a lot of our telephone numbers are associated with geographic location. So where you bought your cell phone is usually where your what's the thing called? So like, for example, my phone number is a 773, and that's a code that's associated with Chicago. So you can get phone numbers that are associated with a specific geographic location based off of the area code. That's the term, area code. But because of there's been so much telemarketing, I'm sure you guys have experienced this, so a lot of people don't answer their phones. Like, I don't answer my phone unless I know what the number is. And then there's also a lot of apps that can screen calls for people who don't want to get spam from telemarketers. There's also computer-assisted telephone interviewing, and it's a set of computerized tools that help interviewers and supervisors by automating various data collection tasks. So it's easier, faster, more accurate. It formats responses into a data file that are keyed in, and it can automate contingency questions and skip sequences. So it's like, on the end of the people doing the interviewing, they can have a program that helps them filter through those questions and assist them in their telephone interviewing. And this is hard too, because sometimes people just don't have the time to do the survey at that specific time. So sometimes interviewers will get around that by asking, can I call you at another date? And like, let's set an appointment. So this is something that's not in your book, but is becoming really important, especially as we're in this sort of risk assessment and trying to understand discretion and behavior of judges and prosecutors and public defenders. So people will get vignettes and they describe a hypothetical situation. And in this case, in this specific example that I have up here, individuals who are sort of laymen, just the general population, were given a sort of vignette and determined whether or not they think that person is risky in regards to whether or not they'll recommit crimes or flee due to bail instances. And so I sort of mapped what people said versus what computer algorithms said and tried to figure out what was more accurate. And so they found that human predictions were a little bit biased and not as accurate as the algorithms, but they were pretty close. So this can be used to understand like how people make decisions, whether that be judges or prosecutors or people in general, just to understand human decision-making in general. And it can be used for pre-testing too. So if you can give people questions that you're trying to test and have them answer it, or answer like how they feel about those specific questions as well. So it can be used to supplement your questionnaire and to help you prepare for one, or it can be used within the questionnaire to understand more decision-making habits and how people come to decisions about specific instances. So for example, there's also been research done on like the punitiveness of people in general and types of punishment they think are appropriate for specific crimes. And when we're just giving the crimes to people, they're a bit more punitive versus when we give them vignettes of specific instances of what the crime was and how it was administered and done, then people are more likely to be a little bit less punitive. And so, like we reiterated during our initial sort of foundation lectures about validity and how to talk about research methods, we can always say there's strengths and weaknesses of any research method. So the strengths of survey research is that they're particularly useful in describing large populations. We see this with the census, we see this with the General Social Survey, and they can ensure uniform responses and measurement, so they're good on reliability. And it protects against respondents interpreting concepts differently. And there's good reliability in well-done surveys. So if your questions are double-barreled, if your wording is off, then your reliability is not going to be great. But if you have done and really thought about the way you're asking questions, and that's why we spent so much time in this lecture talking about types of questions and answers, then your reliability is going to be really good. And that's a real strength of survey research, is that the reliability is high. The weaknesses of survey research is they sort of standardize questions. So they're a little bit contrived and superficial in covering complex topics, right? So much of how people answer is dependent on the wording and how much information they get and how they're prompted. So the responses aren't necessarily accurate to people. If we talk to them in a more qualitative settings, they might have more complex answers than I very much agree or very much disagree. It could be I agree in this specific instance or not this instance and whatnot. And so there's like a lack of context. They're a little bit artificial in that way. And some populations could be hard to contact through customary sampling methods, so we might be getting the opinions of only a certain demographic, especially when we're doing online surveys, right? We talked about how people who do online surveys are more likely to be younger, higher educated, white, and more wealthy. And the validity can be low due to the constructed nature of the research. So when we're thinking about generalizability, it's hard to sort of, if you're doing a survey on a small sample, it's hard to generalize to larger samples as well. And surveys to study crime and criminal justice policy has very special challenges. So target populations that we're interested in are often people who maybe don't have internet access and can't be reached by customary sampling methods like telephone or home surveys. The Minneapolis experiment that we talked about, which was in last lecture about how police officers were prompted to respond in different ways based off of domestic violence calls. The way that they measured their outcome, like recidivism towards domestic abuse by the abuser, was by calling the women and interviewing them. And so that leads to a lot of difficulty and the women actually responding that their partners are abusing them because they know that this study is associated with the police. So they may be less likely to want to respond in the affirmative if their partner is also living with them, right? So a general rule of thumb is surveys are high in reliability if they're constructed well and low in validity. So should you do a survey yourself? I mean, surveys are great ways for you to explore your own research questions, especially via social media. I know that there are a lot of ways in which you could post questions via social media just to your general followers and get other people to like retweet you and whatnot for specific projects that you're exploring. There's also professional research survey companies that will do surveys for you and like have a specific sample of respondents that they look to do the surveys and have those already set up. And so sometimes researchers will outsource their surveys to those companies. And there's a lot of like back-end prep that comes into survey methods of developing the questionnaires, making sure they're really the answers that you allow the respondent to choose are very well constructed, that they're exhaustive and mutually exclusive, right? That's a key. And if you're doing more face-to-face or telephone interview surveys of any size, they're pretty costly. You have to train people and pay interviewers, and that could be costly and time-consuming. But you can fall back on a mail or web-based surveys, which are a little bit more cost-effective. So you really need to think about the short run and long-term costs too, because in the short run it might be cheaper to do a mail survey, but it still might not be the most effective means based off of your research question and the time that you have too, because often surveys that are outsourced take a longer time, or you just have to deal with like So, like mail and home surveys often take a longer time, like in-person surveys versus self-administered surveys are sort of quicker, and you can get responses more quickly. So I have a question. Can a research design both have survey and panel elements? If you recall, yes. Yes, it can. One of the National Crime Victimization Survey, it has a panel element to it too. So it will ask the same people questions over and over again every 5 years or a year or whatever it is. So you can have surveys that have panel elements, and panel element just means that they're asking those questions on a recurring basis to the same people. And so you can have larger issues of fatigue. If your questionnaire is the exact same every time, then the participant might get bored with having to answer the same questions over and over and then leave the study. And then your attrition rate, which is how many people stay in your study over time, can dwindle, and that can negatively impact your results. So you need to think about those things as well. So what method do you think is the best? I think there are strengths and weaknesses to all of them, but which one do you feel like you most resonate with or would use in your own personal research? Yeah, online, because most things in you as students' generations are done online. I think that's a good point. I think there's a lot of ways to do online research and reach a bunch of people. And especially if you're doing like nonprofit stuff or you're an executive director, you can have a lot of leeway with making people do things online. I think there's also your book doesn't cover this, but there's a lot of people doing sort of social media content analysis and people's opinions and analyzing that on social media and discussion boards, which we'll get more into in our qualitative analysis topic. And